The woman at the front of the hall was speaking into the microphone as if the microphone were the room's only legitimate instrument, and Thomas Sullivan was standing in the doorway at the back, trying not to let the door bang shut behind her. She had been 3 minutes late. The parking lot had been full and she had ended up on the street 2 blocks over, walking fast in the November cold with her folder pressed against her chest, the 12 pages inside it representing the better part of 3 months of work. She had attended every one of these civic assembly meetings for 3 years, and she had never been this late. She had never needed to stand in the back and look for a seat. The front was full. The middle was full. The second-to-last row had a single gap, but Mrs. Paulette Greer was sitting at the aisle end, and Mrs. Greer did not move for anyone. Thomas kept looking. In the very last row against the far wall, there was an empty seat beside a man she did not recognize. He was wearing a plain canvas jacket, not the kind of jacket anyone wore to a civic assembly meeting, and he was sitting with his arms resting on his knees in a posture of patient attention that somehow did not look like distraction. She slipped into the seat and folded her coat over her lap and tried to locate where Nora Calloway was in the proceedings. Nora was at the dais. Nora was always at the dais. She was the chair of the Assembly's funding committee, and she ran meetings the way a person runs a meeting when they have run every meeting for 7 years and have stopped remembering that other people also have agendas. She was reading item 4 from a printed list, something about the maintenance schedule for the Birchfield Road easements, and the assembled membership of the Millhaven Civic Assembly was listening with the specific, focused attention of people who know they will be expected to vote. Thomas had been attending since before Nora became chair. She had watched the transition happen, had watched Nora rise through the committee structure with a patience and efficiency that Thomas genuinely respected, had voted for her in fact, and had only gradually come to understand that the respect she had offered was not going to be returned in kind. The man in the canvas jacket shifted slightly in his seat to give her more room at the armrest, without being asked and without looking at her. It was a small thing. Thomas noticed it the way she noticed most small things, which was to say she filed it and kept her eyes forward. Nora moved through item 4 and on to item 5. Item 5 was the funding consideration queue for the next quarter, and Thomas felt her folder get marginally heavier in her lap. Her proposal was in that queue. It had been in the queue for 6 weeks. The Assembly ran on a system where proposed community projects were submitted in writing to the committee, assigned a review number, and brought before the full membership at the appropriate meeting for discussion and vote. Thomas's proposal was number 7 of 12 in the current queue, and number 7 was not going to come up tonight. She knew that. She had come anyway, as she came every time, because 3 years of attendance had taught her that visibility was not nothing. She was beginning to wonder if she had been wrong about that. Nora was explaining the timeline adjustments for item 5 in a tone that assumed everyone in the room shared her confidence in the timeline, when the door at the back swung open again and a man in a grey wool coat came in with a phone pressed to his ear. He took the seat on Thomas's left. He was younger than the man in the canvas jacket, very put together, and he held the phone a little away from his ear, as if receiving a briefing rather than a conversation. After 30 seconds, he slipped it into his pocket and folded his hands and looked forward. The man in the canvas jacket glanced at him, and the younger man gave the smallest nod, and then both of them were looking at the dais again. Thomas wrote in her notepad, Item 5, Q timeline, ask Celeste if she got the amended copy. Celeste Wren was sitting 4 rows ahead and 1 seat to the left, which was where she always sat. She was Thomas's closest neighbour, a retired schoolteacher who attended these meetings with the combination of genuine civic interest and barely concealed anthropological amusement that made her the best possible person to sit beside at any civic function. Thomas could see only the back of Celeste's head from here, the grey braid she wore on Mondays pinned at the nape of her neck. Celeste had saved Thomas a seat at the 5th meeting Thomas ever attended, and they had been coming together ever since, which made tonight's separation feel slightly like missing a step in the dark. After the meeting, they would stand outside on the pavement, and Celeste would tell Thomas what she had missed from the doorway, and it would be precise and funny, and somehow also kind, because that was how Celeste did everything. Nora called a brief procedural pause at 7:40, and the room began to murmur. Thomas pulled a pen from her coat pocket, and it rolled out of her fingers and hit the floor with a sound that, in the sudden room noise, was absolutely silent. It landed under the row of seats ahead. She bent to reach it and could not quite get there. The man in the canvas jacket bent, picked it up from under the seat in front of him, and held it out to her. "Thank you," Thomas said. "No trouble," he said. He had a low, quiet voice, the kind of voice that had learned to take up only as much space as it needed. Thomas registered it and returned to her notepad. At 7:55, Nora announced item 7 of the funding consideration queue, and Thomas felt a measured alertness move through her. This was early. Item 7 was not supposed to come up for another 2 sessions. She looked down at her folder and then up at the dais and tried to find the change in the procedural logic, but there was nothing in Nora's voice that explained it, only the smooth forward momentum of someone who had decided something and was implementing it. Nora read the proposal title from the printed summary, which was Thomas's project name for the Mill Haven Learning Garden, a $12,000 community horticultural and educational space for the east side of Pembridge Park. She read it in the tone of someone reading a grocery list. Then she looked up and said, "The committee has reviewed the proposal and finds that the funding scope exceeds current quarterly allocations. We will table the item for the spring review cycle." Thomas had spent 3 months on that proposal. She had surveyed residents of 4 streets in the Pembridge area. She had gotten written expressions of support from the elementary school and from the Parks Department liaison and from 2 local businesses. She had put every piece of that in a 12-page document that Nora had just tabled in 14 seconds. She did not raise her hand. She did not say anything. This was the correct procedural response, and she knew it. And the knowing did not make the stillness easier to inhabit. The meeting moved to item 8. Thomas wrote nothing in her notepad. Beside her, the man in the canvas jacket had also stopped moving. She did not look at him. She was aware of him with the peripheral awareness of someone sharing a small space, the angle of his arm, the held quality of his attention, and she registered that his stillness was not the stillness of indifference. The meeting ended at 8:30. People filed out in the usual overlapping clusters, the conversations that had been withheld during proceedings breaking open as soon as Nora dismissed the session. Thomas waited for the row to clear before she stood, which took a moment because the man in the grey wool coat had moved ahead of the man in the canvas jacket, who had stepped aside for the older woman on his left, which Thomas also noticed. And then they were both standing and moving toward the door in the general slow flow of the membership. In the foyer she found Celeste waiting for her beside the water fountain, coat already on, handbag over her arm. "They moved item 7 up," Celeste said by way of hello. "I know," Thomas said. "Tabled it." "I know." Celeste looked at her for a moment with the particular attention she used when she was deciding how much to say. "It's not a no," she said finally. "It's a not yet." Thomas looked down at her folder and then back at Celeste. "It's the 3rd not yet," she said. Celeste did not argue with that, which was one of the things Thomas valued most about her. They walked to the pavement outside. The November air was direct and cold and smelled of the dry leaves that had been gathering in the gutters on Beach Street all week. Thomas pulled her coat closed. Celeste said, "Who was that sitting next to you?" "I don't know," Thomas said. "He picked up my pen." "The one in the canvas jacket?" "Yes." Celeste tilted her head slightly, with an expression Thomas recognized as the beginning of an opinion that Celeste had not yet decided whether to share. "What?" Thomas said. "Nothing specific," Celeste said. "He was just watching the committee table your proposal with a very particular kind of attention." Thomas thought about the stillness she had noticed. "A lot of people were watching," she said. "Not quite like that," Celeste said. The second assembly session was 3 weeks later on a Tuesday, and Thomas arrived on time. She had spent the intervening weeks revising nothing in the proposal and reconsidering everything about the proposal, which were two different activities with contradictory conclusions, and she had arrived at the decision that she would submit a written addendum requesting a committee review rather than waiting for the spring cycle. This felt like persistence. She was aware that it might look like stubbornness to some members of the committee. She came anyway. She was early enough to choose her own seat, and she chose the back row again. She could not have said exactly why, only that it felt honest after last time. The man in the canvas jacket arrived 9 minutes before the session opened. He came through the side door, not the main one, and he walked to the back row without scanning the room in the way people scan rooms when they are deciding where to belong. And he sat 2 seats over from Thomas with a folded newspaper in his hand that he did not open. Thomas said, "Hello again." He said, "Hello." And then, after a pause that was not uncomfortable, "Thomas, wasn't it?" She had not told him her name. She looked at him. "You signed the attendance sheet on your way in," he said. "I could see it from 2 seats over." She laughed, which was a small, surprised sound rather than a performance, and he looked at the folded newspaper in his hands with the trace of something that was not quite a smile but was in the same register. "I'm Daniel," he said. "Are you a member?" she asked. "I've been attending for a while," he said. This was not quite the same as answering her question, and she registered the deflection without pushing at it. People came to these meetings for different reasons. Some were members, some were residents with specific interests. Some, like Celeste, were what Celeste described as civic witnesses, present on principle rather than on agenda. "What brings you to the back row specifically?" she asked. "The front was too formal," he said. "What about you?" "The front was full," she said. He looked at her for a moment and then back at the slowly filling room. "How long have you been attending?" 3 years, she said. "The Learning Garden proposal," he said. "That was yours." It was not a question. Thomas looked at him. "It was," she said. "The survey of residents," he said. "You did that yourself?" "Over about 6 weeks," she said. "I walked every block between Pembridge and Adler Street. Some people came to the door and some didn't." He nodded once, as if he were filing this. Thomas had the odd sense that she was being listened to by someone who was actually listening, which was a different sensation from being listened to by someone waiting to speak, and she was not entirely sure what to do with the difference. The session opened and they both stopped talking. Nora moved through the agenda with her usual efficiency. Thomas's addendum request was not on the agenda because she had submitted it that morning, and it required a procedural window that this session did not provide. She knew that. She had come anyway because that was what 3 years of civic assembly attendance had made her. Someone who came anyway. At the break, Daniel said, "The spring cycle is a real timeline. It's not a dismissal mechanism." Thomas looked at him. "Nora's been chair for 7 years," she said. "She knows which proposals she wants to move and which ones she wants to age out. $12,000 for a park project isn't a number she's worried about. It's the project she's not interested in." Daniel said nothing for a moment. Then, Why not? The east side of Pembridge isn't where her donors live, Thomas said, and she said it in the flat, careful tone of someone reporting an observation rather than lodging a complaint. He looked at her with the same quality of attention he had used before, the kind that did not offer reassurance but did not offer argument either. Has she ever said that? He asked. Not to me, Thomas said. Celeste had noticed. Thomas saw her turn and register the conversation and turn back, and she knew Celeste well enough to know that when they were on the pavement afterward, the accounting would be precise. It was. Celeste said, outside in the same November cold, which had gotten sharper by 3 weeks. He stayed in the back row the entire session. So did I, Thomas said. You lived 3 years in the back row, Celeste said. He chose to stay there. Thomas turned up her collar. He seems interested in the assembly process, she said. Celeste looked at her with the expression that meant she was choosing to accept a clearly insufficient answer as a placeholder. He walked out with Warren, she said. Thomas did not know who Warren was, and when she said so, Celeste said, "The man in the grey wool coat. He was there last time too." Thomas thought about it, the man with the phone, the small nod. "They seemed to know each other," she said. "They seemed," Celeste agreed, in a way that left the sentence where it was. December, the 3rd session. Thomas had resubmitted the addendum with an expanded cost breakdown and 3 new letters of support, one from the director of the after-school program on Adler Street, who had been unable to submit in time for the original proposal window. She had also included, because she believed in the value of naming things plainly, a 1-page response to the committee's listed objection about quarterly allocation limits, which showed in clear arithmetic that the $12,000 could be split across 2 quarters at $6,000 each without triggering the allocation threshold that Nora had cited. She felt handing the resubmission to the Assembly Administrator 2 days before the session that she had removed every procedural obstacle she could identify. She felt, walking to her car in the Assembly parking lot afterward, that Nora would find a different obstacle. She had felt this way before and had kept submitting anyway, and she was not certain, in the cold of early December, whether that was virtue or a form of denial she had not yet fully examined. The 3rd session was the warmest meeting she had attended in 3 years, which was to say it was not warm at all in the way warmth usually works, but something had accumulated in the back row that she could not dismiss as accident. Daniel was there before her again. He had a coffee in a paper cup this time, and when she sat down, he said, "The Morning Place on Birchfield Road does a decent cup if you have time before these things." "I usually don't," she said. "You should find the time," he said. It was the most personal sentence he had said to her, and it landed very quietly, the way small instructions land when they come from someone who is not in the habit of giving unnecessary ones. Thomas looked at him, and he was looking at the front of the room, and she could not read anything in his profile except patience. He asked her about the resubmission. She told him about the 2-quarter split. He listened with the quality she had now come to expect from him, which was the quality of someone who understands arithmetic and is interested in how other people use it. "That's a clean solution," he said. "Did you put it in a table?" "Single column with totals," she said. "Good," he said. And then, after a moment, "Nora will say the timing precedent complicates the allocation calendar." Thomas looked at him. "You know how she argues," she said. "I know how committee chairs argue when they have already decided," he said. The session began. The addendum was acknowledged, assigned a procedural review status, and deferred to the committee's discretion. This was not a tabling. Thomas knew the difference. It was also not a movement toward approval. She sat with the distinction and watched Nora move to item 9 on the agenda with the smooth indifference of someone for whom item 8 had already resolved. After the session, The foyer was louder than usual. Someone had brought a cake for the hall administrator's retirement, and there was a small celebration happening around the water fountain, which Celeste was attending with genuine enthusiasm because she had known the administrator since the early years and had brought her own envelope. Thomas was standing at the edge of the foyer holding her folder when she heard Nora's voice from the stairwell door, which was propped open about 4 inches by a rubber doorstop. The stairwell connected to the lower-level meeting rooms, and its acoustics carried sounds upward with a clean, unhelpful efficiency. Nora was talking to someone Thomas could not see. Her voice was clear and carrying, not because she was raised, but because she did not modulate for the possibility of being overheard, which said something about her habitual certainty of privacy. "The Calloway woman," Thomas heard, and then stopped, because it took a moment to understand that there was no Calloway woman under discussion and that the name she had heard was her own. "Sullivan," Nora said. "Thomas Sullivan. She's been submitting that parks proposal for 2 cycles now. She comes to every meeting, which I'll grant her, but she doesn't have donor relationships, she doesn't have board connections, and she doesn't have the kind of standing that moves allocations." A murmur from the person Thomas couldn't see. "She's sincere," Nora said, and the word landed with the particular weight of a word someone uses when they mean the opposite of a compliment. "She's a nuisance donor without real connections. The proposal is fine on its own terms, but I'm not spending committee capital on a park amenity for a block no one significant is watching. The spring cycle will let it age quietly, and she'll either find a sponsor with some weight behind them, or she'll stop submitting. Either way, the problem resolves." The stairwell door did not close because of the doorstop. Thomas stood where she was for approximately 4 seconds, and then she walked to the foyer table and picked up a program from the stack and stood reading it without reading it. Celeste found her there 2 minutes later. She looked at Thomas's face and said, "What happened?" "I heard something," Thomas said, "from the stairwell." Celeste waited. "I need a sponsor with some weight," Thomas said. "That's the actual problem," Celeste said. "You've always known she doesn't support it." "I didn't know she was managing it," Thomas said. "There's a difference between a committee chair who doesn't prioritize your proposal and a committee chair who has a strategy for making it go away quietly." Celeste was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you do with that?" Thomas looked at the program. "I keep going," she said, "but differently." This was what came out of her when she said it, and she believed it, and she was also honest enough with herself to know that it cost her something to believe it in that foyer at that moment, with the cake celebration still going on 6 feet away, and Nora's voice still technically in the air of the room, even though she was no longer speaking. She walked home. She lived 12 minutes from the assembly hall on foot, and she walked because she needed the cold and the movement and the sound of her own footsteps on the pavement to do the work that thinking alone could not quite do. She passed the Pembridge Park East entrance on her way, which she had not planned but which she had also not avoided. And she stood for a moment at the entrance and looked at the space inside the fence where the garden would go. A roughly 40-foot rectangle of mostly unused grass, some gravel, a broken concrete edging that had been broken since the summer before last. $12,000 would not build a monument. It would build something people could actually use. She walked the rest of the way home and sat at her kitchen table with the folder and a cup of tea and wrote a statement. Not a revised proposal. Not another addendum. A statement addressed to the full Assembly membership, not to the committee, requesting that the Learning Garden proposal be brought before the membership for a direct vote under the Assembly's standing provisions for proposals with demonstrated community support. The provision existed. It had been used twice in the Assembly's 23-year history. It required the submission of a formal written argument, a minimum of 20 countersigned expressions of support from current members, and the submitting party's willingness to address the membership directly. It was the option that bypassed Nora's committee entirely. Using it would cost Thomas her relationship with the committee structure, possibly permanently. Nora would know. Every committee member would know. People whose support Thomas might need for other things, now and in future years, would see her as someone who went around the process rather than through it. Which was not precisely true, but was how it would be framed, and Thomas knew it would be framed that way because she had watched Nora frame other things. She wrote the statement anyway. She spent the next 10 days gathering the counter-signatures. 20 members. She needed 20. She went to people she knew, people she had been attending alongside for 3 years, people whose names she recognized on the sign-in sheets and who had sometimes nodded to her in the foyer. Some of them she had never spoken to directly, and she introduced herself plainly and explained what she was doing and why. And most of them listened with the careful attention of people being asked to take a small risk, and several of them signed. She got 23. She submitted the statement and the signatures to the Assembly Administrator on a Wednesday morning, and the administrator, who had not yet retired, received the envelope with the quiet, impassive professionalism of someone who had received every variety of submission in 23 years of civic administration and had an opinion about none of them on the record. The fourth session was a cold Tuesday in mid-January. Thomas arrived early. She chose the back row. The hall was filling at its usual pace, and she could see Celeste settling into her seat 4 rows forward, the grey braid visible from 30 feet, and she felt the small, steady comfort of that familiar sight. She had not spoken to Daniel since the December session. She had thought about the things he had said, the clean solution comment, and the line about committee chairs who had already decided, and she had turned them over, the way she turned over things that seemed to mean more than their surface, without reaching a conclusion she could name. He arrived through the side door at 7:20. He sat in the same place he had sat in December. He did not have a coffee this time. "You submitted the membership petition," he said. Thomas looked at him. "The statement," she said. "Yes." "It's on the agenda for tonight," he said. She had known this. The administrator had confirmed it 2 days ago, knowing it had not made it easier to walk into the hall. "Are you worried about it?" he asked. "I'm worried about what comes after it," she said. "Whether it passes or not." He considered this. "If it passes," he said, "the proposal gets a direct membership vote and the committee's position becomes irrelevant." "And if it doesn't pass," she said, "I've spent 3 years of goodwill in a single evening, and Nora's version of events becomes the only version anyone references." "Yes," he said. He did not tell her it would be fine. She registered the absence of the reassurance and found, somewhat to her surprise, that she preferred it. The side door opened again, and Warren came in. Thomas recognized him now, the grey wool coat, the self-contained quality of his movement. He did not sit in the back. He moved to a seat along the side wall, near the middle, and he was carrying a thin document folder, the kind that professionals carried when they were attending meetings that concerned them professionally. Daniel did not look at Warren when he came in. This was the second time Thomas had noticed the quality of their non-acknowledgement, and it was precise enough to have the character of an arrangement. The session opened. Nora moved through the agenda with the efficiency Thomas knew well. Item 11 was the membership petition. Nora read the title in the same flat tone she used for everything, but Thomas had been sitting in rooms with Nora for 3 years, and she heard the specific, controlled quality underneath the flat tone, the small, additional weight of someone managing their reaction. The procedure required Thomas to come to the front. She went. She had never spoken from the front of this hall in 3 years. She stood at the small podium beside the dais, which was not the dais itself, which was the committee's space but was still the front, and she looked out at the room. She saw Celeste in the fourth row with her hands folded and her expression composed into the precise form of calm attention that meant Celeste was paying every variety of attention available to her. She saw the membership, 47 people tonight, in their rows. She saw the back row where Daniel was sitting with his arms resting on his knees in the same posture she had first noticed in November, watching her with a particular quality of attention she had come to associate with being genuinely listened to. She read the statement. It was 11 sentences. She had worked on it for 3 weeks, and she knew every word, and she read it without looking up, except once, at the 7th sentence, which was the sentence about the 40-foot rectangle of unused grass and the broken concrete edging and what $12,000 divided across 2 quarters could actually do for the children who lived on those 4 streets. She sat down. Nora said, "Thank you. The committee will respond to the petition's procedural claims before we open the floor." She did. She was precise, and she was thorough, and she used the word irregular 4 times in relation to the petition process, which Thomas had anticipated and had not used irregularity in the process. And this was visible in the fact that every procedural point Nora raised had a written response already embedded in the petition itself, because Thomas had anticipated that too. 3 people in the membership asked questions. 2 of them were questions that favoured the petition. One was a question from a committee member that was structured as a question and functioned as a challenge, which Thomas answered from the floor in the same level tone she had used for everything. Then Warren stood up from the seat along the side wall. He said, "I'm here on behalf of Reeve Group Industries. My name is Warren. I'm the Chief of Staff to Daniel Reeve, who is the company's founder and chief executive." The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when something has shifted before anyone has had time to name the shift. Warren opened the folder. He said, "Mr. Reeve has been attending this assembly for the past 3 sessions as a private citizen, which is his right and which reflects his genuine interest in this community's governance. He's asked me to table a letter this evening, which the Assembly Administrator will formally receive, stating the Reeve Group's intention to sponsor the Millhaven Civic Assembly's Community Initiatives Program to the amount of $250,000, conditional on the Assembly's membership structures and committee processes, reflecting the spirit of civic participation for which the program is named." He paused. He has also separately expressed personal support for the Learning Garden proposal currently before the membership. The quiet in the room lasted another 4 seconds. Thomas turned in her seat. Daniel was sitting in the same posture he always used, arms on his knees, and he was looking at her with an expression that she was not sure how to read, except that it was not apologetic and it was not triumphant, and it contained a quality of stillness that she had been watching for 3 meetings without knowing she was watching for it. Nora had not moved. She was holding the edge of the dais table with both hands, and she was looking at the place where Warren was standing, and her face had the specific quality of someone whose script has just been removed from them without warning in front of an audience. Thomas heard Celeste say, from the 4th row, very quietly, and only to the person beside her, "There it is." Nora said, "I'll need to verify the letter with the administrator." Warren said, "Of course." Nora said, "And the committee will need to review the sponsorship terms before any conditional language can be addressed by the membership." Warren said, "We expected that." Nora said, "The Learning Garden petition is still before the floor pending the procedural review I outlined." She stopped. The room waited. One of the committee members, a man named Roy, who had been on the committee for 4 years, and who Thomas knew to be a fair and uncomfortable person, said, "I'd like to move the petition to a full membership vote tonight, given the new information before us." Another member seconded it. Nora said, "We haven't completed the procedural review." Roy said, "The petition's procedural standing was addressed in the submission document. I think the membership has enough to vote." The vote on the petition passed, 29-9 with 4 abstentions. The vote on the Learning Garden proposal itself under the petition's direct membership provision passed 27-11 with 5 abstentions. $12,000 split across 2 quarters for the 40-foot rectangle of unused grass on the east side of Pembridge Park. Thomas sat in the back row while this happened. She did not cry, and she did not cheer, and she did not do anything that could be called a performance. She sat with her hands on her knees, the folder closed in her lap, and she watched the votes get counted, and the stillness she felt was the specific kind that comes when something you have been certain of for a long time finally becomes visible to everyone else in the room. Nora said at the close of the session, "We'll confirm the scheduling details for both items at the February meeting." She said it in the professional tone she always used. Thomas had expected a different tone and had not gotten one, and understood, watching Nora gather her papers at the dais, that Nora was not a person who would be visibly unmade by a single evening. She was a person who would proceed more carefully, having understood something she had preferred not to understand. Thomas could live with that. It was not the ending she might have written, but it was the truth of how those evenings tended to close. And it was enough. After the session, the foyer was quieter than usual, or perhaps it only felt quieter because of what the room had been holding. People moved through it in small groups, speaking at a lower register than they typically used. 2 members Thomas did not know well came to her directly and shook her hand and said things she received with the plain warmth they deserved. She was not someone who performed modesty, and she was not someone who performed pride. And she said thank you, and meant it. Celeste found her near the door and said, "I told you he was watching." Thomas said, "You told me he was watching with a particular kind of attention." "Same thing," Celeste said with the satisfaction of someone who has been patient with an obvious fact for a long time. Thomas looked around the foyer for Daniel and found him near the side exit, talking to Warren in the low voice he used for everything. He saw her looking and ended the conversation and came across the foyer toward her. "The coffee place on Birchfield Road," he said. "I wasn't making small talk." Thomas said, "I know." "Would Thursday work?" he said. She said it would. He nodded once, in the way he nodded when he was filing something, and then he said good night and walked out with Warren. And Thomas stood in the foyer for a moment after he was gone and looked at the door through which he had exited and thought about the pen she had dropped in November, and the man who had picked it up without being asked and handed it back without making a moment of it. The 3 of them, Thomas and Celeste and Roy, who had moved the petition and who turned out to be someone Thomas was very glad to have spoken to properly for the first time, stood outside for a while in the January cold under the light over the Assembly Hall's main entrance. The same pavement where Thomas had stood in November with her folder pressed to her chest and her coat not yet buttoned against the cold. The same steps. The light above them had a narrow warmth that collected rather than spread. Roy said something about the February meeting and the sponsorship terms and the scheduling of the first garden committee session, and Thomas listened and contributed and noticed while she was doing it that she was standing on the front steps. Not the side of the building, not the pavement 2 blocks back from the lot where she had finally found parking in November. The front steps under the entrance light, part of the conversation that was happening there. Celeste walked home with her as far as the Pembridge Park entrance, which was Celeste's direction anyway. They did not talk much. Celeste had said what she needed to say in the foyer, with the patience of someone who had been holding a piece of information in trust until the moment it became shareable. At the park entrance, Thomas stopped. The same 40-foot rectangle, The same broken concrete edging. A cold January night. No leaves left on the grass. The gravel slightly pale under the park lamp. In the spring there would be raised beds here and soil, and the after-school children from Adler Street would come in after classes to learn what grew in what kind of ground. The director had already asked about visiting hours. The elementary school had offered a class project. The $12,000 split across 2 quiet quarters would be enough. Celeste said goodnight and kept walking. Thomas stayed at the entrance for a moment, her hands in her coat pockets looking at the space. She had walked past this fence for 3 years. She had stood here in every season, and she had looked at what was here and thought about what could be here instead, and she had written it down and submitted it and come back to every meeting and submitted it again, not because anyone important was watching, but because the children on Adler Street were real, and the grass was real, and the broken concrete edging was real, and the $12,000 was real, and she had believed, with the plain stubbornness of someone who did not know how to stop believing in something she had touched and surveyed and measured, that these things added up to a fact that could not be permanently ignored. She turned and walked home. The folder under her arm was empty.